Welcome, creative adventurers. I'm Debbie Cohn with Cohn Designs. Thank you for stopping by today. I'm so excited. It's the final week of our A Walk in the Stars quilt along. Do you struggle sometimes because one of your blocks was cut too small? Or you're not sure how to square up a block because you don't have a fancy ruler? Or maybe you're sewing a row quilt, but the row is a little bit off. What to do about the nemesis of many a quilter, sashing and borders? How do you put them in without them ending up wavy or rippling? I've got some tips for you for all of these things and more. Before we get into those tips, I just want to remind you, be sure to download all the free block patterns and the finishing instructions by November 30th, 2023. They'll be free until then. After that, I'm going to take them down off my website and consolidate them into a single pattern, add some more sizes, and put them for sale on my website. So don't delay, download these instructions now. As you can see behind me, I have the quilt top all done. In this version of the quilt, I have a dark background and a single wide border. The other option in the pattern is to have a light background and two borders, one light and one contrasting. I'll have finishing instructions for both ways. Just a note, if you chose to sew the baby blanket, you only need to sew 3 sets of stars. There's no borders, no sashing. You sew them together, add your batting, your backing, your binding, and you're all done. Quick and easy. For those of you who decide to sew a throw like me, then you'll want to stay tuned through the rest of the video for those tips to help you finish your quilt and have it look great. So let's get started. Now that we've sewn all our blocks, it's time to move on to the finishing. Here's a quick demonstration on how to square up a block. There are a couple ways to do this. You could, of course, if you have the correct square ruler, then you could use that and just center the square ruler on the block and trim around all 4 sides. I don't happen to have that, so I'm going to show you how to do it with just a regular ruler and your rotary cutter. The first thing I want to do is to center the block at the correct size. So in this case it's 9.5, and I'm looking to see that just a little bit hangs over at each end. The same amount hangs over, and I look down at the bottom to see if I need to adjust it any. I want to try to center it so that, center the block so that an equal amount hangs over if necessary. That way, when I'm trimming, I will trim the same amount on each side. Then I'll rotate the block and do the same thing. Let me show you what I mean. First, I line my ruler up at the 9.5 inch mark, and I trim a little bit off. Flip it around. Now I line up the block on this side because I know the line is straight, because I know that I've cut a straight side. Then I'm going to cut the little bit that hangs over on this side that is past the 9.5 inch mark. That way I know I have cut evenly on both sides. Rotate the block one more time, line it up, looking to see that I have the same amount hanging over. Here I'm looking to see that the straight line that I've already cut is lined up correctly on my mat. Then I'm going to make sure it's even on both sides, the same amount hangs off both sides. Now I'm going to trim at 9.5. Rotate the block one last time, lining up the straight edge on this side and along the top of the mat, and trim the excess on this side. And that's how to square up a block. The first thing you'll want to do is to square up all your blocks to the appropriate sizes. Those are listed in the pattern, and you want to make sure that you start with the Starflower block. Why the Starflower block? Because the height of each row in the quilt is determined by the height of the Starflower. You'll notice that there are no spacer units for the Starflower block because that's the anchor, so to speak, for the quilt. The other 4 blocks do have spacers so that it brings the total height of the row up to the size of the Starflower block. So make sure your Starflower block is squared to 16.5 inches by 16.5 inches. But what to do if it's not? Here's a troubleshooting tip. If the block is 1/8 inch or less smaller than it should be, that will be fine. You'll just want to mark the block on 2 of the edges so that you remind yourself when you're sewing it so that you'll compensate for it in the seam and it shouldn't be any issue. But what if it's more than that? If you had a big oopsie for whatever reason and the block is more than 1/8 inch off squared, what you can do instead is trim that block to the nearest 1/4 inch smaller. So for example, to square up your block and it's only 16 1/8, then square your block to 16 inches all the way around. Then you'll make the height of the rest of the blocks and their spacers to be a total of 16 inches as well. So there is a workaround, so if you mess up a little, it's okay. It's not a problem. Once you've squared up your Starflower block, then we'll move on to squaring up the other blocks. If, however, your block is more than an 1/8 inch, say it's a 1/4 inch or 3/8 of an inch too small, then you'll want to make yourself a note about that in some way, because you're going to change the height of the spacer unit to compensate for it so that the total height of the entire block unit will be the same as the height of the Starflower in that row. Okay, at this point, if you're thinking to yourself, hold on a minute, Debbie, what do you mean by a spacer unit? Let me explain. If you look at a photo of the quilt, you'll see that the Starflower block is the largest block in the quilt, and it has no spacer sections to it. The height of the block is the height of the entire row. But the other blocks are not as tall as the Starflower block, so I need some spacing or some fill-in background fabric or spacing to fill in the rest of the height of the block, to make it so that the block plus the spacer equals the size of the Starflower block. Here I've laid the Starflower block on top so you can kind of see what I mean. Here I have joined my Ohio Star block with its corresponding spacer unit. Let me show you the pressing on the back. Be sure you press your seams toward the spacer block. The reason for that is because there's a lot of bulk right here, and this will really help keep the bulk out of those intersections. So now you'll go ahead and attach all the spacer units to all of the smaller blocks. The next thing you're going to do before you sew the blocks into rows is to measure each block with its spacer from bottom to top. If it is more than the height of the Starflower block for that row, which normally it would be 16.5 inches, you want to cut off any excess across the top of the spacer. Then the block with the spacer should measure 16.5 inches if that's the size of the Starflower block in your row. After you add all of your spacers, then trim the tops, and you're ready to sew them into rows. You'll want to look at the diagram to see how they're laid out, because the blocks are in order from largest to smallest or smallest to largest, but it varies according to the row. So be sure to consult the photo in the pattern. The only tip I have here is when you're putting them right sides together, you're going to sew along the adjoining seam, of course, like this, is pin starting from the bottom to the top. That way you can ease in any tiny bit of fullness, and if for some reason you didn't get it trimmed exact, you can trim it off the top and your focal blocks will be fine. So go ahead and sew your blocks into the rows. Follow the pattern for the correct order for each row. I'll do that and then show you my row, and after that attach the sashing. Here you can see I've put the first row together. It's looking great. You can see in this particular case I've sewn them from smallest to largest. 2 rows will be that way, and 2 rows will be from largest to smallest. The other thing is that you want to press those seams where you're joining the blocks together, you want to press them toward the larger star. Here you can see one, I've gone from the reverse swatoo star to the Missouri star. This one goes from the Missouri star to the Starflower block, and in those cases I have pressed the seams toward the larger block. You'll do that in every row. After you've sewn your row and you're ready to add your sashing, I've got a couple of tips for you. The tips I'm about to tell you will work well for both the sashing and the borders. The first one is to measure the width of your row all the way across, and then you'll want to cut your sashing strip pretty close to that length, within 1/2 inch or so. Then pin it on, right sides together of course. When you're pinning, don't stretch either the blocks or the sashing strip, just gently pin it. If you're gentle and don't pull or tug on your sashing strips, that will help prevent rippling and buckling when you sew it on. Another thing that will help is to pin your sashing strips about every couple of inches or so, instead of just relying on straightening it out as you go. That will help you to keep it even and help to prevent warping and buckling. The third thing I suggest is that when you actually go to sew it, that you flip it over and sew it from the other side. You'll notice that I have the heads of my pins facing away from the seam so that I can pull them out quickly and easily, and I can see easily when I'm coming to seams, and I try to make sure they don't flip up on me as I'm sewing my 1/4 inch seam. I'll sew on the sashings to each row. The next thing is then to join all of the rows together. I'll do that and come back to you with the completed top. It's looking so great, I'm really excited. Here's a quick partial snapshot of the quilt so you can see the sashing between the rows. And here is the final quilt top, all done and ready to go to the long armor. I've got it pinned up on my design board so it looks wavy, but it isn't wavy in real life. I can't wait to get it quilted and bound. I hope you found these tips helpful. Please let me know in the comments what tip you have to help when finishing up a quilt. I'd love to know, and we can share our wisdom. Whenever you finish your A Walk in the Stars quilt, if you'll email me a photo, I'd love to feature it in an upcoming video or on my blog. For all the pattern information, please go to my blog at dcondesigns.com. And that's it for our A Walk in the Stars quilt along. If you like this video and you love the series, please give it a big thumbs up, tell a friend, and please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Those are the best ways to support my channel. Thank you for stopping by. I'll see you next time. And that's how to square up a block without a... No, you gotta move, baby. Come on, get down.